Right, okay. Welcome to the exciting video of the biological approach. This is the final approach that you're going to have a look at, if you're going to see. So if you have a look at the screen here, you've done learning approaches, you've done cognitive approach, and now you're on to biological approach. So you're going to look at the influence of genes, biological structures, and neurochemistry on behaviour. So how do genes, how do biological structures, and how does neurochemistry, so neurotransmitters and chemicals within our body, influence our behaviour? And then also we're going to have a look at genotype and phenotype and evolution. Don't worry too much about the genetic basis of behaviour. That will come when you look at the influence of genes. Psychodynamic, humanistic and comparisons are all something that you have to look forward to in the second year. So keep tuned for that one. There are some key assumptions. So if you were starting a 12-mark essay, describe and evaluate the biological approach, the first thing that you would say about the biological approach, unsurprisingly, is that biological psychologists or biopsychologists believe that every behaviour has a physiological cause. And then you could say they suggest there are certain things that influence behaviour, which include genes, biological structures, neurochemistry, genome and phenotypes, and evolution. And there you've kind of done a mini plan of your essay already, which sounds really odd, but within that first sentence, if you ever get stuck, you can go back and think, right, I've talked about genes, talked about biological structures, it's time for neurochemistry. And every single one of those essays, every single one of your essays, you want to be able to start it with a sentence. Biological psychologists believe this, cognitive psychologists believe this, and so on. So you have behavioural psychologists believe that all your behaviours are learnt from your environment. Social learning theory believes that your behaviours are learned from the social environment around you, so you learn your behaviours from people around you. Cognitive psychology is your behaviour is controlled by internal mental thought processes. And finally, biopsychology, which suggests that all of your behaviours have physical and physiological causes. You don't really want to repeat the word biological because it's quite sort of the word biological is in the biological approach, so examiners aren't going to think you know what you're talking about if you're just repeating the word biological. First thing I'd like to do, look in your booklets, find these two questions and cross them out. Don't want you to answer them. However, I do want you to answer the two following questions about concordance rate. But if you just want to pause here for a second, go to your booklets and cross out MZ twins with a high concordance rate and DZ twins with a high concordance rate. What we want to focus on is the difference between the concordance rates of MZ and DZ twins. Don't worry, that will all become very, very clear. Do not answer them. Make it extra clear that you don't need to answer them. Don't get confused by them at all. What I'd like you to do here is pause the video and complete the first section of your booklet. So I want you to cover every single activity up until and including the activity on homosexuality and concordance rates. So have a quick look through your booklet now, identify that question about homosexuality and concordance rates, complete from the start of the booklet to that question, and then return to this video where we discuss some of the answers, but of course we save some because we're going to do them in class discussion afterwards. Twin studies. So the first thing that we're going to look at, the best way to tease apart genetic and environmental influences is to look at twins. And hopefully from your answers in the book, you found that MZ twins share 100% of their DNA and are called identical twins, and DZ twins share 50% of their DNA and are non-identical. So to go through that, MZ twin stands for monozygotic, and that means that the twins come from one egg, or dizygotic, so two eggs, they come from a separate egg each, but were gestated at the same time. Concordance rate is the likelihood that if one twin displays a trait, the other twin will as well. And we'll come back to that third point in a minute. The concordance rate then, so the likelihood if one twin displays a trait, then the other one will. So for MZ twin, well, for either twin, if the concordance rate, for example, which is one that we look at later on, a very famous one, which is schizophrenia, is 50%, then what the idea is that if there were two twins and one of them had schizophrenia and the concordance rate was 50%, then it's a 50% chance, half chance, 1 in 2 chance that the other twin B, would also display schizophrenic tendencies. Or another way of looking at it would be, you could talk about intelligence. So if the concordance rate for intelligence was 90%, so very, very high concordance rate. If one person's IQ was 140 and they were a twin, then there is a 90% chance that the other person would have 140 IQ. So that would suggest that intelligence was very, very highly genetic and inherited. Okay. The reason why we use twins quite successfully, twin studies are very useful, is because MZ twins share all of their genetics in their environment, whereas DZ twins only share half their genes but all their environment. And I'm going to show you on another slide in a minute why that's relevant. So what that tells us, if MZ twins share all of their DNA and all of their environment, and DZ twins only share some of their environment, and some of their DNA and all of their environment, the only difference between MZ and DZ twins is that they are genetically not as similar to each other. Okay, so that helps us tease apart. So if we see a big difference between the two, we know that it must be due to genetics, because the only difference between MZ and DZ twins is they don't share 100% of their DNA. That DZ twins don't and MZ twins do. Whereas if they're very similar, that tells us it must be environment, because we know that both twins share the same environment. So it's almost like viewing it, you know how we look at cause and effect, condition 1 and condition 2. So the MZ twins and the DZ twins, the difference between the conditions is that one doesn't share the same genetics. Okay, an easier way to have a look at that and think about that is, if you think here, we've got MZ twins who share 100% of their DNA, which is nature, and DZ twins who share 50% of their DNA, so that would be 50% of nature as well. However, both of them both share exactly the same environment. So they select twins very carefully when we do this. So we don't have twins that don't live together. We have twins that share identical environments in every way. So same parents, same parenting style, same significant life experiences. So positive and negative if there's a death in the family, or they won the lottery, I don't know, something good like that. All of those environmental, those nurturing factors are exactly the same for twin A and for twin B. However, in MZ twins, their DNA is the same, it's identical for twin A and twin B, but in DZ twins, there is the difference of, so they only share 50% of their DNA. So if we see big differences between MZ and DZ twins, we know that that trait is due to nature, whereas if we don't see huge differences, then we know it is more environmental. Okay. So concordance rate, the one that you were asked to look at to have a think about, schizophrenia. The concordance rate between MZ twins was 50 to 40%. So if we work with 50%, so if one twin has it, there is a 50% likelihood that the other twin in the pair also has schizophrenia for MZ twins, whereas for DZ twins, so twins only share 50% of their DNA. If one twin has schizophrenia, there is a 15% likelihood that the other twin will have schizophrenia as well. Both of those are still very high, because schizophrenia occurs within the general population at 1% of the population. So the difference there between MZ and DZ twins, if we use the 50%, is 35%, which is quite a big difference. So what does that tell us? Well, as we said before, because we know that both twins share their environment, so that's exactly the same, but the amount of DNA they share is different, then if there's a big difference, then it must be due to nature. Okay, so schizophrenia is influenced by nature, as there is a big difference in concordance rates, and the only difference between MZ and DZ twins is DNA and not environment. However, it's not 100% in MZ twins, so there must be some environmental factors still involved there. Because if it was purely genetic, then there should be 100% concordance rate, because they have identical DNA. So if one of them has a twin, if one of them has schizophrenia, then the other one will definitely have schizophrenia as well. That's not the case. So although we know there's a huge impact of nature on schizophrenia, we also know that there are some significant environmental issues, and we do look at that in the second year if we choose to use schizophrenia as an optional topic. Homosexuality is the next one, so hopefully this is the last thing that you have completed. We've got male MZ twins at 20% and female MZ twins at 24%, and there is a difference there of 4%. Let me just have a quick check of those figures, because that doesn't look quite right. I'm going to pause the video for 1 second. There we go, that's a little bit better. Apologies, so this now links up with your booklet. So MZ twins, there is a 24% concordance rate for homosexuality, and DZ twins a 20% concordance rate. So if you're a DZ twin and you are homosexual, then there is a 20% likelihood that your other twin will also be homosexual. So let's have a look at the reasoning behind that. What does it explain? There we go. So there's a difference of 4%. This is a very, very small influence of nature because they are very, very similar. The difference is very, very small, so there is only a small difference in a small influence of nature. However, this trait seems mostly to be influenced by nurture because it's quite a significantly smaller concordance rate in general. It's quite a low one, 24%. So even if they weren't significantly different, then we'd still know it was due to nurture because the concordance rate was smaller, whereas a higher concordance rate means more due to nature. Okay. Now continue on to the next activity, explore other traits and concordance. And I will go through these with you in class. So what that means in your booklet next, I think there are 4 or 5 other slides, 4 other concordance rates you need to compare. I'd like you to look at each one, the MZ and the DZ twins, and I would like you to have a look at, work out the difference between the percentages. So of course, if it's high, if the difference is very, very big, then you know it must be due to nature, whereas if the difference is much, much smaller, then the trait is more likely to be due to nurture. Okay. Then what I would like you to do, let me just briefly move to the next slide. Yes, after you complete that, complete the notes on biological structures, and then use this video to check your answers. So the next section I'd like to complete is the biological structures. So you find a definition quite easily in the book, and then what I'd like you to do is have a think back to what you know about the brain and what behaviours it controls. So think of the different lobes within the brain that we've talked about. Ideally, make as many notes as you can without using a note, so with relying on memory. So think about the different behaviours that the brain controls. And then the other thing that I would like you to do as well is also think about the nervous system, so the fight or flight response, focusing on behaviour, but even more importantly, focusing on kind of feelings and emotions. So of course, the fight or flight response makes you have physical responses, but also I'd like to think about the emotional feelings that how will it make you feel, which sounds a bit silly, but it's a basic idea. So if you're physically jumping tense, how do you feel? Think back to that fateful video that Andy showed you that gave you a bit of a shock, that kicked your fight or flight response into gear in class. How did you feel about it when that happened? Okay, once you've made all those notes, so pause the video here and then return to this video once you have completed them. So write a definition of biological structures and then think about how those biological structures influence human behaviour. So how the brain influences human behaviour and how the fight or flight response influences our behaviour. Okay, so biological structures. The definition that should have a rough idea, an arrangement of parts to form an organ, system or living thing. And I think it might just be a case of people remembering that information, recalling that definition. So if you're creating flashcards, that would be a good term to have as a flashcard. So the basic idea is that lots and lots of separate things come together to make one structure. So a really good example that doesn't necessarily influence human behaviour, although you could argue, I suppose, that it does a little bit, is the digestive system. So that's made up of lots of different separate organs, isn't it? So the stomach, maybe the liver, the intestines, whatever that may be, and they are all combined together to make the one structure called the digestive system. And this is exactly the same for the brain, the nervous system and the endocrine system. So in the brain, it's all made together. It's an arrangement of several different lobes. So it talks about being an arrangement of different parts. So there are lots of different lobes of which the brain is all kind of lumped together and becomes called the brain. And there you've got a list of the behaviours, so hopefully you could remember the majority of these. You've got the frontal lobe, which controls higher order thinking and emotion, so they're the kind of human behaviours it controls, problem solving, logic, learning. And then the occipital lobe, which is involved in perception, so processing visual information, so that controls the behaviour of how we see. Temporal lobe, which is hearing and remembering, and then the parietal lobe, which is processing sensory information, so working out if it's too hot, too cold, what all that information is going on. And of course that then influences human behaviour. So absolutely everything you talk about in the biological approach needs to be linked back to human behaviour. And then you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So both of those are from part of the nervous system, and they regulate our responses. So you've got some physical responses, tense muscles, heartbeat faster, digestive system slows down, whatever it may be. And then you also have those human behaviors, those human feelings, so being more anxious and feeling more alert. And then the parasympathetic, you feel relaxed, your heartbeat slows down, you feel less tense, emotionally you feel calmer, maybe feel a little bit tired, all of those things. So every biological structure you talk about, you must link it back to human behavior. Okay, your next step, pause the video, complete the exam questions on neurochemistry, so complete the lovely outline, the process of synaptic transmission question, which I know is your favourite. Use the model answer at the front of the desk to mark it and identify what you'd improve for next time. And I will be asking people in class to tell me what they would improve and move forward. So have a go at it, mark it, either ask someone else to mark it or you have a go at marking it, and then make a list of things. Right, next time I'm going to do this, this and this to make it even better. Then I would like you to make to complete the research task about dopamine and serotonin, and these answers will be discussed in class, so we're not going to go through them. However, I do give a brief explanation of neurochemistry on the next slide. So pause the video here, do all of that, and then return to the video just to check your knowledge. So outline the structures and processes involved in synaptic transmission. So the key thing you need to do there is use the word term pre and post regularly to make it really clear that you know which synaptic pre or post synaptic neuron you're talking about. So that's really important, and we've spoken about that in class a lot. Make it clear that it is an action and potential that is more or less likely to fire in the postsynaptic neuron. So the key things there are the action potential part. So make it clear it's the action potential and not the neurotransmitter, and also that it's the action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So again, we've discussed this in class. Hopefully this was your opportunity to kind of regulate that. It also talks about the structures and process involved in synaptic transmission. So it's really important you refer to the objects, you named things, so the pre and the postsynaptic neurons, the synaptic gap, the receptors, the transporters, the vesicles or vesicles, whatever you want to call them as well. And then key things to discuss and include in your essay would be that neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap and they bind to the receptors, and that's the absolute basics you need for a minimum of 2 marks. Okay, so I know you all have more knowledge than that, so hopefully you've marked it. Give yourself a mark out of 4 and tell me how you would improve. Now neurochemistry comes under 2 definitions. 2 sort of concepts or things. So neurochemistry could be talking about neurotransmitters, or it could be talking about hormones. Now I won't focus too much on hormones, although they do come under the endocrine system. So I'd like you to have a quick pause of the video here, discuss with someone next to you, have a quick think, what kind of hormones are there that influence the way that our body works? So they are hormones, not neurotransmitters. So hormones are things that run through your body. So have a quick think. Okay, so possible hormones that you might have considered would have been testosterone would be a really, really good one. And again, as always, we're linking it back to human behaviour. So don't just say that there is testosterone in the body. Tell me what effect that has. Well, of course, that makes us very, very aggressive, or fairly aggressive. The higher the more increased the levels. So that's something you could talk about. So when we talk about neurochemistry, you could be talking about hormones such as testosterone influencing our desire to be aggressive, but also the other thing we can refer to is neurotransmitters as well. And the key way to discuss this in the essay question is you would start by explaining about neurotransmitters and neurotransmission briefly in general. So the exam question you've just asked, not only did it hopefully refresh your knowledge of it, neurotransmission, but also it prepared you for writing this essay question. So I'd want a really brief explanation of what neurotransmitters are, just to go, look, I know what I'm talking about, examiner. And then I would like you, the most important thing to do is follow it on with specific examples of neurotransmitters, which must be linked to human behaviour. So one of the ways that the biopsychologists believe that the human behaviour is influenced is neurochemistry. There are 2 examples of neurochemistry. There are hormones which run throughout our body which might influence the way that we behave, for example testosterone, which makes us more aggressive. Another example would be neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters work by being released from the presynaptic neuron, moving across the synaptic gap and binding to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, allowing for an action potential, a nerve impulse which is electrical, to cross a gap the synaptic gap by turning into a chemical and then sort of continuing along, returning back into an electrical impulse. An example of this would be, and then you could talk about dopamine, you could talk about serotonin, and hopefully you followed the instructions in the booklet. And if you haven't, if you want to do that now, so if you want to tell me, do some research and tell me a couple of behaviours that are affected by high dopamine, high serotonin, and low serotonin. And it's very, very tempting to get lost in some of the physical behaviours, and I'm still happy for you to include some of those, but the key ones I want you to talk about are human behaviours that psychologists are interested in, and also things that you might be behaviours you might be quite interested in as well. So a lot of those neurotransmitters are linked to certain mental health conditions, which is quite interesting, high and low levels of those. So what I would like to do in between that, before we move on to genome and phenotypes, is I'd like to pause and I would like to fill out the genome and pheno activities within your booklet. So tell me what they are, and then also complete the activities related to them. So I think I ask you to talk about hair colour, eye colour, and various other ones as well, and how they work. Okay. So if you want to just pause the video there, make those notes, and then return. So, genome and phenotypes. Genotypes refer to the genetic makeup of an individual, or to the genes that an individual possesses. So when they are born, these are the genes that they have. And I'm sure you probably know more about this than me from GCSE biology. You could talk about things like them having certain genes for eye colour, certain genes to determine hair colour, to determine height, weight, absolutely everything that you see. And then phenotypes refer to the observable traits. So without being very, very technical scientists, we can't really observe our genes. However, we can look at observable traits. So the way that those characteristics have been displayed in an individual. And they are due to, and this is really important, a combination of genes and environment. So our phenotype is our observable traits, which are due to a combination of genes and environment, whereas genotypes are the genes an individual possesses, or our individual makeup, genetic makeup. Okay, and both of those definitions are taken directly off a mark scheme from the exam, so you can be really confident on those. Yet another one, if you're making flashcards, and two really useful terms that did turn up in last year's exam, and I think they were poorly answered questions, so are likely to come up again. Okay, and then you want to have a look at PKU, and hopefully you've made some notes on that as well. So they have a genotype, the genetic mutation that causes PKU. However, the observable traits of PKU, i.e. the symptoms, are controllable. So they're only expressed if their diet isn't controlled, so isn't low in protein, because that's what causes the problem. They don't metabolize the protein, and then that excess protein causes them some issues. So PKU, the genotype is a genetic mutation which they access, and then the phenotype is the observable characteristic. So two people, and I think this is on the next slide, two people can have the same genetic mutation, so the same genotype. However, due to the interaction of the environment and genes, they have different phenotypes, so different observable behaviours. So one person where they're controlling their PKU with diet has no symptoms whatsoever. However, person two, because they have the genotype and their environment isn't controlling for it either, they display some of the symptoms you can see there. So behavioural difficulties, different types of skin, eczema, vomiting, jerky movements, musty smell, etc., etc. So you can have a look at all of those, and that information was taken from the NHS website. So if you do want to briefly pause and have a quick look at PKU on the internet, on the NHS website, then you're more than welcome to. And this is an example, and I'm going to make an assumption here because I don't know, but it's an example of you could argue two people with the same genotype, so two people from the same family who have the same genetic mutation for PKU. However, one of them, clearly their diet wasn't controlled and they're displaying symptoms of PKU, so their phenotype is very, very different from the little girl who doesn't appear to have any of the symptoms. So therefore, although they both have the genetic genotype for PKU, the interaction of genes and environment meant that one of them had the observable symptoms, so whereas one of them didn't, so their phenotypes are different. Next step, pause to complete a minimum of 2 examples, and ideally if I were you and going for more I'd complete all 4 for genome and phenotype. So I think I talk about hair colour, eye colour, I want you to think carefully about those, and kind of genotypes and phenotypes. So you could have a genotype for a certain type of hair colour, but why might that observable trait be different because of the way it's interacting with the environment? Then watch the video attached and make notes on evolutionary approach. So we're going to go through the genome and phenotype stuff in class. Watch the video on evolutionary approach, complete the evolutionary activities up to and including the gap fill, and then watch the video, my video, to check your knowledge. So complete everything to do, finish off the genome phenotypes, complete everything to do with the evolutionary approach up to the gap fill, and then watch the video to check your knowledge. So if you just want to pause here, do that, and then return. Hello. So evolutionary approach. There are 2 things that all animals want to do according to the evolutionary approach. They want to survive and reproduce. What does the word adaptive mean? It's a behaviour which contributes to the survival of an animal. So if a behaviour is adaptive, it helps us survive. And why do certain behaviours get passed on? So why do these adaptive behaviours get passed on? Because they help the animal survive and reproduce, meaning their offspring will have the adaptive behaviour as well, ensuring their survival and reproduction. So this will make more sense when you see some examples. But for example, physical strength would be a good thing to think about when you think about adaptive behaviour, so having lots of muscles and being quite brave as well, so personality traits that fit in with there. So of course that behaviour gets passed on because you're brave and because you're physically strong. You're willing to attack people when they come to attack you, and therefore you protect yourself. So if you protect the characteristic of bravery and strength allows you to protect yourself, you protect your genes, and then you can go on to reproduce. When you reproduce, of course, you carry on that genetic propensity, so that genetic leaning towards being strong and brave, so your children will have it as well. And of course that continues because it's an adaptive, a positive behaviour. It continues throughout sort of the generations. Okay. And why do certain behaviours die out? Well, the same thing, they're not adaptive, so they don't help us survive, so therefore the animal dies and then they can't pass on their genes. So a brave, strong person survives, can reproduce and pass on that gene to be strong and brave, whereas somebody maybe who's not so strong or isn't very brave or isn't very clever or whatever it might be is more likely to die out because they can't protect themselves, can't feed themselves. Of course, when you're dead, you can't pass on your genes by reproducing. Examples are usually the easiest way to make that clear. So the key thing that I would like you to do is look at this example and then explain other evolutionary examples in this way. Historically, students have really struggled with the evolutionary explanations and making them effective. I think they understand them in their mind, and when they talk about them, when I can add extra questions on, but writing them down in an exam, unfortunately, they just don't show off their knowledge to the best of their abilities. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to identify, explain, expand, and then without, which will make more sense in a minute. So first, when you're talking about a trait such as the lovely giraffes in the bottom hand corner, you want to identify the adaptive trait. Giraffes have the adaptive trait of a long neck. Then you want to explain why the trait is adaptive. They developed this because food is scarce, so only the leaves on the top of the trees were available. So why is it an adaptive trait? Well, because food was scarce. So what does that adaptive trait ensure? As we know, all adaptive traits ensure that we survive, we reproduce, and we pass on our genetics. So the giraffes with the longer necks were able to reach more of the food. These giraffes were able to survive and reproduce, and this is the most important, key, vital thing that if you don't do anything else when you explain an evolutionary example, explain this. Passing on their genetic propensity towards having a long neck to their children. So you must take it further than that. You can't just say, oh, it helps those giraffes survive. They've got a longer neck so they can eat the food, so they're all right. It's not just that. It's about the fact that they can eat longer food, they can survive, so they can pass on their genes. Whereas, and this is where the without comes in, what happens without those adaptive behaviours? Oh, let me just pause so I can move my giraffe so it becomes a little bit clearer what the answer is. There we go. So they're nice and happy now. We're in the top right hand corner. So without that gene, the giraffes that couldn't reach the leaves higher up were less likely to survive, so couldn't pass on their short neck gene, so short neck giraffes died out. So if you're dead from not being able to eat food, you're not going to be able to pass on that gene that stops you being able to access that food. So the key things there are the two underlying terms. The fact that you use the word adaptive, which is very, very important, and then also that you take it to the end of its sort of logical conclusion, pass on their genetic propensity towards having long necks to their children, who are more likely to survive, therefore continuing to pass on their genes for long neckedness. What I would like you to do now, let's have a look, is, again, next steps. I'd like to pause here. And before you complete the evaluation points, what I would like you to do is there is a website in your booklets, and there is also some examples. So I think it's the peppered moth, mussels, and something else, and then you come across Buss, who's done some research into human behaviour. So it's okay to talk about animals within the evolutionary approach, but I would encourage you to also have some human behaviours that you can discuss as well. So I'd like to pick some of those. I would say 2 or 3, or ideally all of them if you're feeling particularly confident and really want to practice. Or if you're not feeling very confident, it's probably even better to do more to practice. And what I'd like to do is I'd like you to identify the adaptive trait. So you might need to read the website that's linked there to work out, because you think, what on earth is she talking about peppered moths? It tells you, it gives you the information there. So identify the adaptive trait, explain why it is adaptive, expand on that. What does an adaptive trait ensure? And then what happens without that adaptive trait? And as long as you always remember to do that, identify, explain, expand, without, then you should be able to very effectively explain the evolutionary approach. Keep referring back to this slide with the giraffes on. However, if you pause here on this slide, complete that, and then come back and I'll tell you what you need to do next. We are going to go through the evolutionary slides separately in class because I want to check all of your very interesting answers. So next, I would like you to complete the evaluation points. So the final thing you've done, you've explained all of the biological approach in far more detail than you'd ever need for a 6 mark. However, everything we have covered, as you've seen, is on the specification, so you could be asked a separate question on it. So my advice would be to pick the 3 things that you are most interested in within the top 3, within the list of 5, to talk about in a 16-mark essay, because you only get 6 marks for AO1. And apologies, I don't mean 16, I mean 12. You only get 6 marks for AO1, or even less possibly in some cases. So you want to pick those. The key thing you want to be able to do in lots and lots of detail is talk about the evaluation points, the AO3, that is the next thing. And I'm going to ask you to try and word them now, but we'll discuss them in class together. Okay. So you have the scientific approach, the fact that it's deterministic and real-world applications, and there are 2 strengths and a weakness there. After you've completed those, I'd like to go at your extension activity. Remember the A3 sheet we stuck in when we stuck loads of other sheets in to do with the behaviourist approach? That is allowing you to summarise all of your approaches, so it'd be really well worth your time after you finish the evaluation points, rather than sitting there waiting for the end of the session, getting those out and summarising each one of the evaluation points, not only the evaluation points, but the approaches, the AO1 and the AO3 of all your approaches. So when you come to revise, which I'm sure you're thinking about doing, because you know it's only sort of about 9 weeks away, if you have a quick look at the countdown timer on the wall, it's either in the room that you're in or the room you're just about to walk past when you leave. You've not got long left at all, so keep an eye on that revision. Scientific methods then. So scientific methods, the strength of the biological approach is it uses scientific methods. And I want you to think about all the different scientific methods it used. But also, handily to help you out, the CAP book does detail some of the methods. If you're feeling particularly brave, what I would encourage you to do is include some research that you can think of that would link with the biological approach that would constitute scientific methods. But mostly they are experimental methods, so lab, brain scans. We could talk about twin studies, although there are lots of problems with twin studies, and what I'd seriously encourage you to do if you were definitely aiming for the really, really high grades is to go on to if you Google evaluation of twin studies, Psychology Wizard should come up, which is for Edexcel, not AQA, but the evaluation points for the twin studies are extremely useful, and you could use them as a however point. So examples, experimental method, quasi experiments, because obviously we look a lot at different people, the characteristics they already possess. We don't randomly allocate them to condition A or condition B. And why is that a good thing? So think about all the things we've talked about, and I think I've given you a list of key terms to use. So can you be confident of cause and effect because you can reduce extraneous variables? Whatever it might be that you can think of, is it easy to replicate lab and quasi experiments? What does that allow us to do? What can we then check for? Remember, we are checking for something. Just because we can replicate something doesn't automatically make it reliable, so please bear that in mind. The more you can put in the explain sentence, the better. And then if you're feeling particularly brave, you could say, however, the biological approach relies on twin studies, and then tell me some of the problems with twin studies, which are a little bit more complex, but definitely worth it. So really focus on that explain sentence. And then finally, determinism. So the idea of determinism versus free will picks up even more in A2, but the basic idea is, remember we spoke about Skinner saying that free will is an illusion. So we think that we have free will and free choice, but actually we're just responding to environmental stimuli. The biological approach has a similar concept to of biological determinism, so we are just influenced by our biology and nothing else. So we think we have choice, we're thinking we're choosing whether to eat that piece of cake or not, whereas in fact that's actually not the case. It was always destined to be one way or another because of certain hormonal balances, neurotransmitters in the brain, evolutionary approach. So we are designed to want to crave salt because salt was very rare and it was vital for our development. However, now salt's very easily accessible, but people still crave that salt. So the idea is of that's the biological approach. The problem there is something to consider, and it is in the cat book, is the idea that of kind of removal of responsibility and thinking about the significant impact that it might have on the criminal justice system. So suddenly if everybody went, well, it wasn't my fault that I killed this person, it was all down to my biological structures and evolution, then they're going to find it very difficult to approach that. So that's something to consider. And the example you could give is you could go back to some of your neurotransmitters and say, so it's quite deterministic, for example, and then tell me about if you have low levels of serotonin, according to the biological approach, what's absolutely definitely going to happen, how am I going to feel, and that I have no control over. And of course, is that the case or not? Which I'd like to think not. There is an element of choice within everything that we do. And then finally, real-world applications. Now, this is a strength, and I would encourage you to look forward in the book, and I think it says on which page it is, to SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they stop serotonin from being reabsorbed through the process of reuptake, because you wouldn't say reuptaken because that's not a word, but you all know about reuptake, don't you? So things being returned back to the presynaptic neuron using transporters. Well, when they don't have enough serotonin in the body, the SSRIs come and we take them and they block the transporters, increasing the amount of serotonin in the synaptic gap. When that's in the synaptic gap, where's it going to go? Well, of course, it's going to bind more to the receptors, increasing its excitatory or inhibitory effect, depending on how it's working that day. So I want you to have a read of SSRIs, think about drug treatments, and be able to go into as much detail as you possibly can about those. Now, is it having real-world applications a good thing? Why is it? So we claim that the reason that people act differently, or the biological approach claims that the reason that people act in certain ways is because of their neurotransmitters. If we then give them drugs to change the level of those neurotransmitters and their behaviour then changes, what does that tell us about the theory? Well, it must be accurate, and if a theory is accurate, then it must be high in validity. We'd never use the word accurate in psychology. If you want to use the word accurate, what you actually mean is validity. So we're claiming to measure, or we're claiming to explain human behaviour, and oh look, it looks like we are actually explaining human behaviour. That's the most difficult one to explain, but again, particularly if you're going for the higher marks, but even if you're going for any kind of grade at all, really do try and explain the real world applications and how they work. So have a go at those evaluation points, structure those, we'll go through those in class, and also your extension activity theory, your A3 sheet. If you finish all of that, give me a shout, let me know, and I'm sure I can think of something else to support you with your revision. So it would be about you choosing what it is that you want to do to help yourself revise. Okay.